So we might as well get started. So first of all, I guess I'm almost surely not the first professor saying that to you, and maybe a day late or something on it, but welcome back, everybody. And welcome to Venture Capital and Entrepreneurial Finance, which actually, if I got to choose the title myself, I would actually call it Venture Capital and Startup Financing. And I'll talk a little bit about the distinction of what I think of as entrepreneurial finance versus startup financing. Because entrepreneurship has two things, kind of small scale entrepreneurship and super ambitious high growth entrepreneurship like startups. Those two things are so different, it doesn't make sense to talk about them in one course. So I'm really going to focus on startups in this course. And that's really the domain that VCs or venture capital invests in. But welcome to the course. I hope you guys are going to find it valuable. Yeah, I hope we have fun with this course experience together. Despite the fact that I understand this is not an ideal way of experiencing this whole course experience. It's not ideal, but let's try to make the best of the situation. And one thing that I do want to point out as well is this is my first time doing a full course, online teaching like this. So I don't pretend to know the best way to do everything. The university has provided a lot of resources to help us have a more informed and well thought out opinion on stuff and plan, but still you never really know. And so what that means is I'm not going to pretend like I know it all in terms of the best way to engage with you guys and the best way to try to spur engagement with you guys in these live sessions and stuff and stuff like that. So I want to be very clear that I encourage all of you guys to send me feedback. I mean, especially early on when there's time for me to make adjustments. I mean, I can't completely reverse course on completely tilt the ship, but I can adjust the ship. And so, if you guys feel there are little things I could do to improve the effectiveness of the course for you, please do not hesitate to let me know. Because I appreciate the feedback. Even if you think the feedback is critical, like I can, I'm old enough that I can take critical feedback, especially if it's constructive, right? So I really want to say that I want to encourage you guys to do that, because it'll help me deliver a better course experience to you. It'll also help me help me know you better. It'll also help me probably become a better teacher in the future for future generations of McGillians as well. Right? So I feel there's many tiers of benefit to doing it, so please don't hesitate. Though none of it is a requirement. As I said in the email I sent yesterday, the objective of today's lecture is twofold. One is we're going to give a high-level course introduction. You guys are welcome at any point during this lecture and by the way, any other live lecture, let's be clear, to ask me questions. The way you can do that, one way, you can unmute yourself. You're allowed to do that here. And you can unmute and just ask the question, even if I'm in mid-sentence, okay? That's totally okay. Another alternative, for those of you that I can visually see, if you go like this, I'll probably eventually notice, especially if there's just 20 people, because I can see 20 screens on my screen. So I can see all of you at once. I'm not sure. Maybe if you move like that, it moves you to the front of the queue. So that I don't know, right? But in any case, you can try that. If I'm not noticing, then my conjecture that I would see it is wrong. I don't have a TA right now in the course, but I'm trying to get one. And so if I get one, I'll also have someone monitoring the room. So you can always ask a question in the chat. When I share my screen, I don't easily see the chat. So that's why it's useful. Like that really only is likely to work when I have someone else helping me in the room, which that's just not set up now yet, because we just got told that we have resources for it yesterday. But when that's the case, you'll be able to either private message a question or to that person that monitors the room, or you can public message. And in the messages, you can either write the question or you can just say, oh, I have a question. And then they will unmute themselves and make sure that I pause my speech to let you guys ask your question. But just, just know, like, you guys can ask questions anytime. Historically, I found that this course benefits greatly. I said the same thing to my class this morning. It is actually true in both courses, Applied Corporate Finance and Venture Capital, that both courses, can have a very nice discussion component. Because both of these things are based off of not just formulaic thinking of stuff, but bringing in a bunch of different perspective and sometimes asking a little bit off of the beaten path questions. And I can't think of all of those things. So sometimes you guys ask questions that either like hit to the heart of something that I was going to talk about quickly, but it helps me realize I should talk about it in more depth right now. Or sometimes you guys even ask a question, I haven't thought of it before. So that's nice because it gives me a chance to think about something, to say, well, maybe I'll learn about it later. And so, yeah, I think it's additive to the course experience for the question asker, for the other students, and for myself. So my hope is we build a bit of a culture, and it's probably going to be gradual. We build a bit of our, VC fall 2020 culture of just ask questions. You don't need to be worried about whether you're asking a good question or not. There's no bad question, right? And there's no such thing as a question that's too simple. Sometimes the simplest questions are the best questions because they really get to the heart of what's most important. So you shouldn't be self-conscious about asking a question. There's never been a case that I can remember where a student has asked a question and I've revised my opinion of that student downwards because of the question. Never happened. I don't think I'm bullshitting. I think I'm totally honest here. So want to encourage it. And by the way, if you ever want to be in startup circles or in VC circles, you better start learning to speak up, because that's an environment where it's really important for you to take charge of question asking. And to, a lot of question asking is about coming up with an independent thought and trying to chime in, or asking a question that isn't the obvious question to ask, right? And being good at doing that stuff and being confident in doing, because there are plenty of people who think of great questions and don't have the confidence to ask it, right? Gaining that confidence is supremely important in VC, in startup, but by the way, in everything, related to the business world. So I think this is a pretty low stakes environment to go ahead and just gain comfort if you haven't gotten it yet, because you will not be penalized in any way, shape, or form here, right? If you're really worried, just don't show your video. People will be like, I don't know who that person was, but they asked a good question. But yeah, so I want to encourage that, right? And again, I want to encourage it in all contexts: lectures, course overview, when we're working through a problem, when we're having an open-ended discussion on something. There is no context where this stuff is not well-placed and merited, okay? But as I said, today's lecture, what are we doing? We're doing a high-level overview of the course and kind of a high-level overview of the first topic that we're going to be doing in the class. So I'm trying to give you guys kind of a quick summary of things in this first lecture. So you guys are probably already tired of seeing my image in a big screen. So I am now going to start sharing my slides so that we can start going through some of that material. I will at some point toggle back and forth between slides and the syllabus so that we can talk a little bit about the timeline for the course as well. Sound good? All right, so I see nodding. That suggests that things are okay so far. I don't think there was that much room for me to screw up this early. Okay, so let's go. Everyone can see, what's happening here? So everyone can see my slides right now, correct? Perfect. So yeah, course title, and this is the topic we're on. We're starting topic 1. Before we start topic 1 formally, right, I do want to talk a little bit about the course, but I'm going to keep it pretty brief. If you guys have questions, you can, but also keep in mind the syllabus. I think I didn't attach it in the email yesterday, but I posted it on my courses. The syllabus goes over, I think, a fair amount of detail about the expectations in the course and technical things like group formation and what weight is placed on homework deliverables versus the final exam. So I think like nitty-gritty questions like that, you can actually probably scan from the syllabus if you haven't done so already. So I don't think it's necessary to talk about it here. But I think what's important to talk about is the overall spirit and objectives of the course, tell you guys about the different topics that we're going to cover in the class, talk a little bit about the timeline and the distinction between live sessions like we're doing today and non-live sessions. And then after we do that, we'll kind of go more directly into starting the formal content for the course. All right, so hopefully everyone is cool with that. Let's go ahead and start. So what's the course about? So I think, as I said, the title, pretty informative, with the only caveat that I would have changed entrepreneurial finance to startup financing. What is this course about? You know, this is the first paragraph in the syllabus, right? No, so it's, you know, the course is about really providing an introduction to startups, right? So from the title, you might not realize how much this course is specifically about startups. So I would say startups are very much front and center here. And then investment from the perspective of the VC is kind of maybe front and center, or, you know, silver medalist to the gold medalist that is startups, right? But it's an introduction to startups with an emphasis on the institutions and real world practices that are employed in the venture capital industry and in the startup ecosystem more generally. One of the things that I want to emphasize about the course is that whenever we're covering this material on startups or on investment or on the types of financing deals that startups and investors agree in, right? In all of that stuff, I'm always going to try to present that topic from multiple viewpoints. So I'm not just going to focus on the perspective of the venture capitalist in this course, right? I will also think, well, what about the perspective of the startup founder or the startup employee, or even lawyers that help VCs or startups with transactional stuff like negotiating the financing contract, or thinking about the perspective of an investment banker that's thinking about formulating or forming a relationship with startups that look like they might go public someday, right? I want to give multiple viewpoints, and there's a very practical justification for that, especially in the context of venture capital. So I'm not sure, this might actually be a bit of a disappointment to some of you guys, but it's not easy to get a job in VC. There's a simple reason for that. It's basic economics, supply and demand. A lot of people want to work in VC, but VC itself is actually a pretty small sector compared to other forms of delegated investment management. Much smaller than mutual funds, much smaller than hedge funds, much smaller than buyout funds. It's small. Niche is not a fair characterization, because if you look at the amount of value creation, VC has created a lot of value, right? But it's actually pretty small in terms of AUM compared to other categories. Other categories are maybe trillions. VC is like billions. So it's well, you know, maybe like 100, like let's call it 1/10 the size, although that's not a very zoned in number, right? But a lot of people want to work in VC, so it's just, there's so many people looking for a given opening that it's not easy to get the job. I don't want to give you guys the illusion that everyone in this class is definitely going to get a job in VC within 2 years of graduating from the BCom program. Like, that would not be a realistic claim, right? Now, you know, because of that, I want to deliver a course that has practical value to you, and I define practical value as, you know, a course that has a reasonable probability of teaching you something that's useful when you work on planet Earth, right? And so, you know, if I only taught you about VC, and realistically 5 years down the road, 10% of you could work in VC, that would actually be a successful outcome as far as I'm concerned, okay? Like, that's how difficult it is. Well, then this would be a problem, because I'm expecting to at most help 10% of my class, right? So how do I make it more practical? There's a bunch of other jobs in the startup ecosystem, right? So let's try to give some nuggets for all those other potential paths as well, and we ratchet up the probability that this actually helps you down the road, right? Other things where it could help is, like, what if you're a growth equity investor, right? Who makes investments into companies just after they go public, or even sometimes tries to get into some of the late stage private deals that are more advanced than like typical earlier stage venture capital, right? But where those companies haven't quite gone public yet. Think of like late stage investors in Uber or stuff like that, right? So, that would include things like, a SoftBank. It would also include some hedge funds like Cotuman, right? All of these things, I'm going to try to deliver some value for a bunch of these different roles that you could also realistically, potentially enter into, in the next, let's call it 5 years or so. That's the reason why I want to give them multiple perspectives. The perspectives are also not like totally separate from each other, right? They're interconnected. So understanding everyone's perspective can actually be helpful for you to do things right in each of the individual roles, right? If you're going to be, for instance, negotiating with someone, it's pretty useful to be able to put yourself in their shoes, right? And so it helps for that as well. So even if I knew I was going to go in VC, I would still want to know what's the perspective of the entrepreneur, right? Or the startup founder, right? So that's a real motivation for why in building this course, and I designed this course from scratch myself. In building the course, I really, really leveraged all the members of the startup ecosystem that I had personal contacts with to really be able to bring in a lot of these perspectives. So that's something that I view as a part of the course that I'm happy about. So hopefully you guys value that as well. We'll talk a little bit about alternative funding channels as well, so not just VC. So as I said, that could be later stage growth equity for private companies or just gone public companies. Also earlier stage stuff like before VC, like angels, right? Angel investors, individual or angel investor groups. We'll talk a bit about those, but disproportionately weighted on the investor side to VC. And that's at a very high level. That's what I want you guys to get comfortable with. And again, I as much as possible, going to try to show you guys stuff that at least in some way is explicitly done in practice, right? I'm really trying to build this off of what people do as opposed to building it off of a textbook, which is why there is no textbook in this class. I'll give you guys all the lecture slides and everything. So I think in terms of buying stuff, you don't need to buy much for this course. It just turns out there isn't a great venture capital textbook in the marketplace because venture capital textbooks, for one reason or another, they're written where they try to pretend that like a VC should do the same thing as any run-of-the-mill corporate finance, when that's just wrong. And I'll talk a little bit about that in my course overview part of this course. One of the important things to get today is to be able to understand what exactly I mean by startups or VC fundable entrepreneurial ventures, and why those companies are different from mature big business and require different types of analysis, different types of financing. At a high level, I want to give you guys that appreciation today. All right. The course itself is divided into 4 sections. And I actually think of this course as having 2 personalities. There's the personality you will see mostly in the first half of the course, and the personality you will see mostly in the second half of the course. The first half of the course is going to be mostly qualitative. Not entirely, but I would say 80 to 90% qualitative. Right, so really understanding what does the life cycle of a startup look like, right? What are the challenges that startups need to overcome really early at their founding and in the first year or so? What are the typical main challenges that they want to try to overcome? What are the best practices in terms of governing the strategy for achieving that? What sort of milestones should they be looking for, right? Really, really early on. And once they confront and hopefully successfully solve those initial challenges, what are the next batches of standard categories of challenges that they confront? And after they do that, after they go from early stage to like more mid stage, and they kind of graduate to larger scale where they've figured out a lot of stuff and they start trying to grow as rapidly as possible, what sort of things do they have to consider there? And as things progress, if things are continuing to go well, right, when and how do they think about exiting, right? With startups, right, You know, you can have startup founders or startup employees. On paper, they're like wildly wealthy, but it's all paper wealth. They literally have no money in the bank account to go buy themselves a home or something like that, right? And so exit matters a lot. When can you take some of that paper wealth and make it actual, you know, spendable wealth, right? And what are the different ways to do that? You know, traditionally it's been things like the startup gets acquired or the startup has an IPO. How has the set of possibilities enriched over the last and enlarged over the past decade? We'll talk about things like that. We'll talk about the structure of venture capital funds and venture capital firms. We'll talk about how to try to gauge whether a VC firm is good or bad and the challenges that make that more difficult than assessing a mutual fund, for instance, or a hedge fund, right? So a lot of these things is going to be also a lot about thinking about the specific nuances that are true about startups and about private early stage investing. So that we're going to answer questions that you guys have thought about before in, say, a Finance 2 or something like that. I actually don't know what I think maybe only Finance 1 is a requirement. You don't need to have taken Finance 2 for this course. Let me be clear. But like some of these things, we're going to take a different perspective from maybe what you've heard advocated in courses that are more focused on analyzing more mature, steady, predictable companies, right? And that makes sense because guess what? The real world is not one size fits all, right? So you want to understand like what's the most appropriate lines of thinking for different types of companies and how does that tend to evolve over time? And yeah, so a lot of the way we approach things with startups, both as a startup founder, startup employee, and on the investor side, very early on, we tackle it like extremely qualitatively. There's a practical reason for that. Like when a startup starts, there's no historical data and it's usually doing something brand new. So you can't even find analogies or it's kind of a bit of a stretch to do it, right? So it's tough to find comparables. Well, guess what? You know, the one thing I know about statistics, I know more than one thing about statistics, but the one thing all of us know about statistics is no amount of statistic is going to help you do statistics with a data set that has 0 data points. Like that's a math theorem right there, right? Early on, very little like directly usable data. So you got to go qualitative. Like it's just, there's no beating around the bush there, right? But as a company evolves, you can start to do things more quantitatively because you have that data to try to anchor on, right? So that's why we got 2 personalities, because we're thinking about that evolution within the life of a startup where you go from like really having no choice but to rely on qualitative stuff to being able to analyze things quantitatively using something that looks more like an adapted version of our bread and butter finance toolkit to analyze. And so because of that, when you look at like early stage and late stage VC, for instance, you see systematic differences between the ways that VCs within those 2 types of funds approach assessing investments, right? One is going to be more qualitative. The other one's going to be more quantitative. By the way, when you're assessing things qualitatively, right, you realize like, man, like it's not like it's very easy for you to figure out who the winners and losers are, right? Look, if I've got less information, I can make a less sound decision, period, right? So we just naturally accept like there's going to be a lot of misses with early stage investing that only relies on qualitative, the little morsels of qualitative that you can infer. Well, if you want to claim that you add value as a VC when you're not able to like pick the gold from the shit or something like that, right? The needle in the haystack or something like that. You better be able to say that you add value in other ways, right? Like I can't pick the winners and losers, but I can take a silver medalist and make them a gold medalist. Or I can pick, you know, 4th place and put them on the podium, right? So being able to convincingly convey to startups that you want to invest in, that they should accept your money because you will help them. Well, that justifies why I want to talk about the life cycle of startups in this course. Because I don't think many people can add value to something if they don't know that thing well. And so if you want to be a credible investor, especially early stage, you better really understand the challenges that these startups confront and start building resources around you to be able to collectively add and help your portfolio companies. So that's the motivation on qualitative. Topic 1, life cycle starts. We want to really understand a startup, even as an investor, so that we can help add value to that startup if they are kind enough to accept our money when we want to give it to them, right? So that's the motivation for the first one. Second one is the qualitative frameworks that we use to evaluate potential startup investment opportunities, right? So early stage, you don't have a lot of data to rely on. What are the key questions that you ask about a startup's project, i.e. its product and its market, and about its people, the quality of its founders, the technical strength of its remaining team, right? What are the things you look for qualitatively on both of those dimensions to try to decide, like, this is a good bet to take, right? Topic 2, that's one of the things we talk about. But these frameworks are pretty rich. There's a bunch of different questions, and you'll never find anything that's amazing in every single dimension. You know, if you sit with a checklist and you say no every single time a startup comes to you and isn't a check mark in every single box, you will never invest. And like that once in a lifetime where you want to invest, guess what? Every other person in the world is going to want to invest. So you'll have to pay up the wazoo to actually buy into that. Right? So you might be right, it's a winner, but you'll be consensus and right, i.e. everyone else knows it's right as well, so you won't earn an outsized return. The way to earn an outsized return is to be right, but to also be contrarian. So you know you're right, but everyone else, when you invested, or not everyone else, but enough other folks were like, no, this isn't good. And so because of that, you had pricing power in negotiating the pricing terms in that investment. That's how you earn outsized returns, right? The early investors in Twitter earned over a 1,000x return on their investment. I.e., you put in 50,000, you got 50 million. Okay, that usually sounds pretty interesting to folks. It's not a representative outcome. Let's be clear. You know, the reason why they earned 1,000x is because most people early on, when they saw Twitter, they were like 140 characters. Who the hell will want to use that? What is this, right? Like the people who took a bet on this made a contrarian bet. There are things you can do to increase the likelihood that you'll successfully make a contrarian bet. And so we'll talk about some of the qualitative guidance around that as well. One of the things that helps you make a contrarian bet. By the way, it's easy to make a contrarian bet where you end up being wrong, right? It's really the contrarian and right case that's the holy grail, and that's really difficult. But one thing that can help you is if you have good strategies for predicting important trends that happen in the future, important technological innovations, or so discontinuous innovations, or just trends in innovation. A discontinuous innovation might be something like Apple comes up with this amazing iPhone, and that totally changes the landscape of things you can do with something you hold it, with the cell phone that all of us kind of has, right? That was a game changer. It enabled suddenly a bunch of things, right? Then you have more gradual things, like we know predictably every year computers are going to become a little bit stronger. Right? Not muscle-wise, but like they'll be able to do things faster, cheaper, and in higher volume or something like that, right? And, you look at the history, that rate of improvement is semi-predictable. Well, if you understand that predictability, you can start to say to yourself, well, this is not possible right now, but if computers become twice as powerful and half the weight, this will be possible. So I think we're about 2 years away. That can be helpful, right? So understanding strategies for forecasting future business opportunities off of things like changes in technology, also changes in demographics, right? Can be very helpful. So we'll talk about strategies like that also in topic 2, right? But again, as I said, mostly all of topic 2 and almost all of topic 1 is qualitative. and a bit more geared towards the early stage VC investor from an investor standpoint, right? But then in topics 3 and 4, we start to get more quantitative. We actually flip from being 90-10 qualitative to being 90-10 quantitative. So it's a dramatic shift, right? So be forewarned, like there are those two personalities, and it's going to be switching after the drop deadline. So if you're like, oh, I love qualitative, and then all of a sudden it switched, don't blame me. I told you, right? But the quantitative stuff, I'm going to do 2 things. One is going to be essentially adapting DCF valuation, so to value startups, but specifically incorporating the nuances of startups themselves, so that we're going to do it a little bit differently than say what would be done in a corporate finance class for a mature company. Okay, so we're going to do that. And then in topic 4, we're going to do quantitative stuff around deal structuring. So deal structuring, you can think of the analog in corporate finance as capital structure, right? How do companies raise the money that they need to fund their projects or to fund their business, right? And it turns out this question is simpler in traditional corporate finance than it is in a startup context. In corporate finance, a lot of what we talk about is just debt versus equity, right? How much leverage should a company have? You know, there's some different types of debt. Maybe we get bank debt, maybe we get corporate bonds, right? But there's not a gigantic material richness in the set of possibilities for the types of instruments you have in terms of funding the whole company, that mix of few different types of debt and equity, where equity pretty much means common equity almost entirely, right? For public companies, for instance. Turns out it's more complicated with startups. Startups, by the way, they don't use a lot of debt. There's a little bit of debt. It's growing a little bit over time. But for the most part, startups, you know, if you calculated their leverage percentage of company's value that is debt as opposed to equity, it would be very small, much lower leverage than public companies, oftentimes close to 0. But equity is more complex because every different round of investment, right? Because startups raise multiple rounds of funding, right? So you'll have that first round of VC investment, second round of VC investment, third round of VC investment. It turns out every one of these investors aren't buying the same common equity. They buy some form of preferred equity that is going to be basically equity with downside protection, but every new round of investment is individually negotiated. And so when you have 5 rounds of funding, you will have 5 different types of equity. Actually, you'll have 6 different types of equity, because you'll have the 5 different types of equity that the investors each bought, and then you'll have the common equity that like the employees and the founders own, right? So it starts to become a mess. And by the way, every time that there's a new round of funding, we re-hit the drawing board. So what you owned before changes once you add in a new funding round. And it can create these weird conflicts of interests between different stakeholders. And it has implications for what each of these different securities are worth. And so topic 4, we're going to analyze that. We're going to analyze these contracts. We're going to understand what are the types of contracts that are actually used in practice, right? How do they interact with each other? And given all those potentially complex interactions, how is the pie, which is this company, actually split amongst different stakeholders? And it's going to turn out to be a weird pie. It's going to be a weird pie because the way the pie is split is going to depend on how big the pie is. Right? And so we're going to talk about the analytical procedure to really make sense of that. And if this sounds like a classroom theoretical thing, it isn't. It's given a name by practitioners. It's called waterfall analysis. That is the procedure of doing exactly what I just said, albeit, you know, I described it right now. It's abstract, so you're not supposed to know what this means. It's just giving you a sense of where we're going. And we're only getting to this part that I'm talking right now at the end of the course. but it is something, it is literally one of the main things that if you work as an analyst at a VC fund, that's one of the things that you're basically going to be doing, is a bunch of waterfall analysis on companies that the fund is thinking of investing in, or companies that they think are going to exit soon, right? You're going to do that a lot. Yeah, if you fall into that, hopefully 10% that get a job within VC in the next few years. But it's a core, it is a core interview question, and it is a core on-the-job task for young folks in VC. So we're going to do that. And then we're going to think about how the implications of how the pie is split affects the values of each of these different securities. And that's going to involve some option pricing techniques. So there will be a bit of option pricing at the end, but I'm going to try to present.
Hey, Jairo, can I butt in here for a second?
Sure, Seth.
Yeah, sorry about that. Could you re-explain the waterfall analysis? I didn't quite understand that.
It's just, waterfall analysis is just basically saying, if the company exits for $100 million, what percentage goes to the first VC investor, the second VC investor, the third VC investor, and the founders and the employees? So maybe, I think I mentioned 5 different stakeholders here. Maybe if it's a 100 million exit, they each get an equal amount, 20% each, so 20 million each. How do those percentages change if the company exits at 200 million, at 300 million, at $1 billion? Because it turns out it's not always going to be 20, 20, 20, 20, 20, 20, because everyone doesn't own common equity. And so figuring out exactly how those percentages change is actually a pretty nuanced exercise. And we will cover how to do that exercise. And it's just, and I want to emphasize, it is not a nerdy exercise that only a professor sitting in their office would do. It is done in the real world by people at the entry level of the investor side of VC. Okay. So
Got it. Thank you.
And if it doesn't sound precise yet, it's not supposed to be. This is an high level overview, right? But yeah, that's what waterfall analysis is. And you guys could also just Google waterfall analysis, and you would get a bit of a definition there. But we will treat it in all its rigor in this course, I promise, right? But yeah, so in addition to that, in this problem, we're going to talk about the nuances of valuing VC securities as opposed to an entire startup. Topic 3, value the entire startup. Topic 4 is how is that value subdivided across the different stakeholders? And you can't answer that without option pricing. So we will make use of option pricing, but I will do it in as user-friendly of a manner as I'm capable of doing. So I have put a lot of thought in how to present that part of the course without requiring you guys to be too sophisticated with option stuff. So if you're like, oh man, I haven't studied options, or, I saw it for 1 week in Finance 1 and it, made my head explode. I'm not assuming in this class that you guys have background knowledge on it, right? So I will try to cover it in a way where, as much as possible, we try to demystify stuff, okay? But that's basically the course. If you guys have detailed nitty-gritty questions, about group formation or about, when the final exam is going to occur, that hasn't even been decided yet, or exactly when the homeworks are going to be due. So these things I haven't even tried to specify exactly yet, because I feel like there's enough uncertainty in this new, course delivery environment that we're dealing with, that pinning down today, homework 1 is going to be due on October 27, just to me would seem like hubris. One of the things that we learned both in startups and the other course I teach, which is applied corporate finance, is that flexibility is valuable, especially when we have a lot of uncertainty. I feel like we have more uncertainty this semester than we would in other semesters, so I want to preserve flexibility. So the due dates that we're going to have for the course deliverables, by the way, there aren't that many course deliverables in this class. There's going to be 3. I'm going to give 4 homeworks, but only 3 of them, the first 3, are going to be needed to submit. And then there's going to be final exam that's going to be time take home. That's it. So I know some of you guys have taken my ACF course, either are taking it now or have taken it in the past. This course is materially less work than my ACF course. Here, I mean, it's not no work, so I don't want to give you guys the wrong impression. But I'm going to be a bit flexible with the with due dates on stuff, and mainly with an eye of making things work from your perspective. Okay, so even like when I post a homework, I'm going to put a proposed submission date. But if you guys are having difficulty within your group, because some of you are in Europe, some of you are in Asia, some of you are in Montreal, you just email me and you say, look, we're having this difficulty because of this. I'm not going to think like, oh, wow, you must be lazy. I'm going to be like, I get it. Right. So it's a negotiation, and you guys have a lot of the bargaining power in the negotiation. Okay. I'll just say it up front. The only thing I'll say is the later you submit something to me, the later you're going to get a grade back. Right. But aside from that, I'm just going to generally be pretty flexible. Sound good? All right.
Just chime in really quick.
Yeah.
If I can. I was wondering, is it 3 homeworks or is it 2? Because that are actually being graded. Because I think in the syllabus it says 2 are graded, and you give out 3. But
oh, yeah. I think that's right. You're right. I misspoke. It's 3 homeworks given, 2 of which are graded. We have 4 topics. So first homework is going to be topic 1 and topic 2 combined, and the second homework is going to be topic 3. But yeah, you're right. Sorry, I misspoke. It's 2 submittable homeworks and an exam. That's literally the course in terms of deliverables. So yeah. But here's one of the things I'm going to say. Look, at the end of the day, you guys have control on how you approach this learning experience. But there's a lot of, I think, value in the course that I'm not going to be asking you guys in a homework, or like necessarily testing you guys explicitly on the final, because I want to make the final predictable so that you don't feel like you're blindsided by something, right? And so that means you can approach this course in 2 ways. You can approach it where the stuff that isn't going to show up on your transcript, you just disregard, or you can say, I want to learn that stuff too. If you want to like be credible in the real world, I think you want to take that latter approach as opposed to the former. So that's what I recommend. But at the end of the day, you guys are adults. I let you guys make your own optimization. In fact, I don't even judge. So, there are plenty of things where I could have done more in courses, but I wasn't so into it, so I just didn't do it. I mean, it doesn't make me an idiot or anything like that. I think the same thing of you guys, right? So, but yeah, I would say more than other typical courses that I would teach, this course has things that I think are super important, but that are essentially not testable because they're too all over the place. Thinking about evaluating startups is much less unified than how to analyze a more mature company. Because since you don't have a good unified source of data, you have to pick the insights wherever you can, meaning you scan far and wide and you go and look for all sorts of different things, right? It's more opportunistic. But how do you simulate being opportunistic on an exam? It's just, I haven't figured out how to do it, right? So that's a reality. I don't want to sound too preachy, sorry. Okay, yeah, so as was mentioned, 2 submittable homeworks and 1 not submittable. In past years, I would make participation an important part of the grade here. This year, just because of the circumstances, I'm not doing that. But I still hope that we can engage in this environment.